Dr. Sadler is here to present the Analytic Continental divide. It'd probably be easier, actually, to say what he hasn't done than what he has done. But obviously the most important is that we have a YouTube star amongst us. But anyway, so he's also the president and co-founder of Reason.io. He is doing an entire video series bravely trudging through the phenomenology of spirit through Hegel and explaining it. Let's see. He earned his PhD from Southern Illinois University in 2002. Taught all over the East Coast, but he had an epiphany when he was at Marist College that he must move to the philosophical utopia that is Wisconsin. And he has kindly flown down here for us. I think that's all I got.
That sounds good. Yeah, well, I've never heard Wisconsin described as a philosophical utopia, but it is pretty great to be back there. That's where I'm from originally. So, I think I was ready to leave in my 20s, and now I'm ready to be back in my 40s. So I was asked to talk about the Analytic Continental divide as a general topic, and what analytics and continental philosophers can learn from each other more specifically. And I do intend to talk about that, but I think I should probably lay my cards on the table from the beginning. I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm neither an analytic nor a continental, although I do work on some figures in continental philosophy. I'm more a historian of philosophy. So I do a lot of my work on historical figures, and I look at things in a historical way. So I'm going to do some talking about that more towards the end. What I'm going to suggest is that one of the things many philosophers who identify as analytics or continentals could learn, although not so much just from each other, is that there's a much vaster and richer world of philosophical approaches out there that they can draw upon. So what I was thinking I would do is lecture for about 90 minutes or so, have 30 minutes of Q&A at the end. When I say lecture, I don't mean that I'm just going to talk straight for 90 minutes, which I think would be rather boring and tiresome. But I'll raise some points, and I'm sure we'll have some questions, and maybe we'll take a break every so often when we need to for general discussion. So feel free to ask questions at any time. If you take me off course, I'm pretty good at getting back on course, so don't worry about that. The structure of the talk, what I wanted to do first is actually talk about, and I've created a handout to sort of launching point for this, talk about the way in which we tend to think about this divide, and some of the ways that analytic philosophers think about continental philosophers and vice versa, or at least the way they're represented. And then I want to talk about my own background in this, which is a bit unusual, and how that led me to what this focus on the divide leaves out. And then I want to talk about how we might define or characterize different kinds of philosophy in general, not just analytic and continental, but other movements as well. Then we'll focus in on trying to answer the question, which we won't actually completely do, what is analytic philosophy? We'll do that for continental philosophy. Then we'll talk about the notion and the history and really the ongoing reality of a divide, along with a few examples of people who bridge or talk across that divide. And I'd like to finish by talking about what else there is for, what analytic and continental philosophers have to learn from each other. We'll talk quite a bit about that. But I also want to talk about what they can learn from other philosophers. And I'm going to put in a plug for thinking about philosophy in a more historically oriented way, which we often associate with continentals, but I don't think continentals on the whole actually do a very good job at that. I think they're very selective in their use of history. Some of them, not all of them. So if we think about, what are the things people typically say? You can look at this chart and see whether you think this is a fair representation of how analytic philosophy and continental philosophy get contrasted in your own experience, in the literature that's out there. There's quite a vast literature out there comparing analytic and continental philosophy. It's something that will crop up every so often in blog columns, in the New York Times, in part because it seems to be of perennial interest. I mean, what do you guys think? Is this a fairly accurate depiction of what's good and also perhaps what's maybe blind spots or problems with the two different modes of doing philosophy? What would you say? I mean, most of you are analytically trained, right? Is there anybody in here who would say that they're continentally trained, where that was the main focus? No? Okay, so one person. So it's primarily analytics and what they would say about continentals. Does this work? I mean, continental philosophy, we know that it's coming from the continent. That one's, I think, pretty uncontroversial. Ideals of critique, at least they use that word quite a lot, subjectivity, imagination, as opposed to sort of other ideals of clarity, objectivity, rationality. Sometimes rationality is even a dirty word among some continental philosophers. More aligned with the humanities. Would you agree that's true? It's interesting if you think about the social sciences. So we can say that analytic philosophy traditionally, historically, has been associated more with the natural sciences and mathematics. The social sciences are in an interesting spot where some of their practitioners have much more in common with analytic philosophy, some much more with continental philosophy. What do you think about the criticized as incomprehensible, relativist, trendy or faddish, obscure, polemical, poetic, and so on? Would you say that's accurate as far as like what they get criticized for? Yeah. What about the one for analytics? Criticized as ahistorical, myopic, superficial, imperialistic is a popular one for a while, unimaginative. Have you heard these complaints? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so we have a more or less agreed upon starting point, and we'll come back to that. So now my own background, I had a strange introduction to all this stuff, in part because I didn't go to a place that was primarily analytic or primarily continental, either for my undergraduate or my graduate studies. And my undergraduate, I wouldn't highly recommend it. I don't know what it's like now these days, but if it's like what I had, I don't think I would recommend it for undergraduates to study philosophy, because they thought that there were really three kinds of philosophy living at the time. Those were analytic philosophy, which seemed to be dying out. We're talking about like the mid-90s here, so clearly it wasn't dying out. But that was their view. Existentialism, so it wasn't all continental philosophy, just existentialism, and process philosophy. Those were the three main going concerns. I managed to get introduced to continental philosophy by a fluke. There was a Japanese student in my modern philosophy class who wrote a 60-page paper for the class, in which he incorporated all sorts of contemporary continental theory, including Deleuze and Derrida and Bakhtin, and he had these books, and he felt that his English wasn't good enough to present the paper, and he wanted me to do it. So he just gave me these books and said, "Why don't you read these, and this will help you present it." I didn't give the books back, and I kept them on my shelf, and then I started reading them, and I thought this was interesting stuff. I also majored in mathematics while I was an undergraduate, and so I did a lot of work in the intersections between philosophy and mathematics, specifically in logic, foundations of mathematics. I was getting very interested in philosophy of language at the time, and so I was reading a lot of stuff in analytic journals, totally discouraged by my professors. I would just go to the library and kind of read around stuff that looked interesting, getting just a smattering of stuff. Then I went to graduate school, and I went, like Joseph said, I went to Southern Illinois University. And Southern Illinois is a particularly interesting place in that it's a pluralistic department. So they have representatives of analytic philosophy there, they have representatives of continental philosophy, and then what they're really known for is American philosophy, classical American philosophy, including, but not exclusively, pragmatism. They have the John Dewey Center there. I actually got kind of turned off on Dewey because I heard about him so much at that place. But it was great because we would have, every class, there were, if it was a primarily analytic class, it'd be mostly the analytic students there, but there'd be a smattering of other people. So you'd always get challenges coming in. You needed to speak each other's language, at least to some degree. And the relations were not always cordial. As a matter of fact, there was a history at one time of some pretty tough battles between them. But it was good to see. I also got interested in the history of philosophy there, not because SIU had a strength in that, in the philosophy department, but because I was studying languages. And so I did my Plato and my Aristotle in graduate school with the classics department, just reading them in Greek. And I got interested in Anselm and Aquinas through working on my Latin. And that led me into taking a more and more historically oriented perspective. The philosophy departments that I've worked in and organizations and conferences also tend to be pluralist as well. And so there'd be some analytics, some continentals, and then a whole bunch of other people that didn't fall into that spectrum. And so when I think of the divide, I've always seen it as a little bit arbitrary, and it got me interested in why is this the case. I never really gave it an awful lot of thought until Joseph told me he wanted me to talk about it, and then since then I've been doing a lot of reading in the literature about that divide, and there is a huge literature out there. In general, what I can say is this, that it is something that does exist, but it represents a kind of limited or limiting view on philosophy that can interfere with getting a good grasp of some other areas in philosophy that one might miss. And I've got a couple analogies here. It's sort of like if we were, I'm a big metalhead, and so those of you who are into that genre can probably grasp this analogy. It would be like if, in discussing heavy metal, one claimed that really all contemporary metal is either in the black or death metal range or is a form of alternative metal. So there's no classic metal, that's not really metal, there's no thrash, there's no power metal, there's no glam, there's no nothing. It's just those are really all the main going concern. Another perhaps better metaphor would be like a long-standing feud. A feud in which most of the current feuders don't really know how the feud got started, got continued, got renewed, and they don't really know all that well many of the side that they identify with. They know some of them very, very well, but the rest of it they're a bit hazy on. And they know that those other guys over there are bad or, doing something wrong, but they're not, they have some ideas of what it is, they've been told what it is, but there's a lot of haziness about it, you might say, and some rather global judgments and assumptions, usually based on hearsay or a few experiences. Because if you want to have a bad impression of continental philosophers, it's not hard to find it. Just go to SPEP and wander around into a few sessions, and you're going to hear some goofy nonsense. But that's not the whole of it, right? You can't judge from those few experiences. And so it is sort of like a long-standing feud. There's limits to what we can do with analogies, but what have we left out? What doesn't fit into this divide? Well, most of the main traditions or schools or movements of Western philosophy and ancient, medieval, and modern philosophy don't fit neatly into it. There's analytic readings of history of philosophy, and there's continental readings, but that's not quite the same thing as actually, reading Plato for Plato's own sake, sort of reading Plato in light of Plato. There's also non-Western philosophy, a huge world out there of that, and comparative philosophy. And some of that does get done by analytics and by Continentals, but not that much. Classical American philosophy doesn't fit into this divide. Where do pragmatists fit? Just to pick one of the groups. African American philosophy or Africana philosophy changes names from time to time and place to place. Feminist philosophy, there are analytic feminists, there are continental feminists, there are some who say that it's a distinct tradition of its own. That probably does merit being taken seriously. Philosophy is a way of life. Maybe some people in academic philosophy think that's just sort of pandering, but it's interesting that it's out there and that it's got quite a lot of traction. So these are all worth thinking about. Where would they fit in here? They're not in the divide. How do they inform any of that? So let's then talk about how we would, let's call it, and not say define philosophy, but characterize philosophy. So when you look at your philosophy textbooks, or those of you who teach, when you teach your intro class, or probably a lot of your other classes, one of the things you have to do is say, well, what is philosophy for the people who have that as a question, right? That's a very difficult thing to do, isn't it? And there's reasons, I think, good reasons why it's difficult and why we're not often happy with what we say. Some of the reasons have to do with the very nature of philosophy, and we can understand philosophy not just as, say, an activity, but also as a disciplinary field and as a body of literature, as all three of these intersecting with each other. And as a side note, this problem of adequately defining philosophy and that distinction that I just made between three different ways of looking at philosophy, that came up in something I've done a lot of work on, this rather obscure debate that took place in France in the 1930s about the possibility or nature of Christian philosophy. I ended up writing a book about it, mostly of translations. And they hashed out these same issues, though. What is philosophy? And it was interesting to see that they weren't on the same page. It was good for them to have to try to clarify to each other what exactly is philosophy and what isn't philosophy, but they never achieved a consensus. And if they didn't achieve a consensus in that small community, we're not going to achieve an overall consensus in the entire philosophical community. It's going to be a perennial issue. Some of those reasons. On the one hand, there's a genuine question that's what we can call an outward-facing one. It would be nice if we could give some sort of characterization of philosophy to people who are asking us from the outside, hey, what are you doing? That would be good. And then there's an inward-facing question. We're ourselves interested in, well, what are we doing when we try to pause from this particular activity or that particular activity. And nearly any way of describing philosophy ends up looking like a description from some particular point of view. Try it out, and see whether you're not bringing in some assumptions about philosophy coming from some particular way of doing philosophy. And that's, I'm not saying that's a terrible thing. It's just one of the conditions that we work under. Philosophy is also in the past, maybe not so much in the present, but in the past, had what we can call you might call a totalizing ambition. And I don't mean this in a pejorative sense. It tried to extend itself to everything. To have you might say a theory of everything, right? Or at least some systematic conception of it. Now, in the 20th century, we've seen some efforts to try to prune philosophy down to something more manageable. Those all presume that philosophy, first of all, is able to do that, but even when you prune stuff away, you're still taking a stance on what you're pruning away. So there's still kind of a totalizing thing to it, which makes it difficult to define as well. Not only that, if we really engage the past of philosophy, the great thinkers that you guys have those pictures up in the hallway, for example, and that's just a few of them, and we don't just sort of shoehorn them into reductive categories, but we really look through them, we find a multiplicity of ways in which philosophy has been done and structured and understood. Even if we just look at the ancient period, the Platonists had a pretty different conception of philosophy in certain respects than did, say, the Epicureans, or when Plato's Academy goes skeptic, they have a somewhat different conception as well. So all that said, what about these two important ways of doing philosophy in the present? Does that mean that it's hopeless? We can't say anything about them? Well, that would be extraordinarily strange, wouldn't it? Because we know there is something distinctive to analytic philosophy, and presumably there's something distinctive to continental philosophy. So how might we go about characterizing them and differentiating them like this? So one thing we could do is focus on national or cultural or linguistic spheres. That's one thing. We can also focus on canons of literature, who should be read. We can focus on what other disciplines are typically engaged or become allies. We can focus on characteristic methods that are employed, including attitudes towards arguments and texts. And we can also focus in on ideals or aims for philosophy itself. This is not an exhaustive list. There's other things I think we could do as well, but I think that's quite a lot to work with already. So I want to set these out and then discuss why, although initially promising in our present time, particularly in our present time, they're not really adequate for telling us what analytic and continental philosophy are, although they may be all that we have. So start with the easiest one, national and linguistic spheres. Where is analytic philosophy done? Primarily. There's some people doing it in France, by the way, and Germany. But where is it primarily done?
English speaking.
Yeah, the Anglosphere, we can call it. Where else? There's another area where you find it, where it's the predominant way of doing philosophy.
Scandinavia?
Yeah. Why is that? Isn't that a weird thing? Well, shouldn't they go with the rest of the Europeans? But culturally, they've been sort of in the orbit for a while. And, English is a very common second language. So there's that. Continental philosophy, European continent, of course, so France, Germany, Italy, Spain, but it's also a big concern in South America. It's hard to say exactly where else, because you can find it all around the world. There's also massive colonies here. There are continental departments here as well. Now, it's good to note that different areas did develop different philosophical approaches and literatures, but that's really more of a starting point. It doesn't answer any questions for us, I think. We can point to, perhaps sociological features of French culture as opposed to English culture, but I don't know that we get that much mileage out of that. And it's important to note that we're having this conversation at all, because presumably some analytic philosophers would like to know what they can learn from continental philosophers, not just because they're over there in Europe, but because you can find them here at Fordham or Duquesne, or where else would we go? There's a lot of other pockets where you can find people doing it. SIU would be another place as well. What about canons of literature? Can we identify analytic philosophy or continental philosophy with who they read? Well, think about why a canon is important. Or you might say, how is a canon important? It tells you whose ideas or approaches or systems are worth looking into, worth paying attention to, worth studying. Maybe also, reacting to. Who do you need to take seriously as an adversary? And who can you just totally dismiss? Who should you borrow from? I'm going to return to this issue of canon later, but I think it's not a particularly promising one in the present. I think it could have been useful around 1960 for characterizing continental and analytic philosophy, or maybe even 1980. I don't think it's as useful now, and I'll tell you why in just a bit. Maybe another way we can think about it is, how does philosophy situate itself in relation to other disciplines? Because philosophy doesn't exist in a vacuum. You guys are fortunate enough to have your own, building here on campus, but that's not the norm in most places. You're stuck usually with somebody else. We can say that analytic philosophy historically, and probably even in the present, gets along better with the sciences and continental philosophy with the humanities. Would you say that's a fair assessment? In quite a few places where the philosophy department is analytic, much of the continental philosophy will actually get done in the other humanities departments, like the English department, history department, poli-sci. Now, what about social sciences? I brought that up a little bit earlier. Psychology, anthropology, economics. Do they fall out on one side or the other neatly like that? It really depends on where you are, doesn't it? And which one you're looking at. Anthropology, it depends on how you're doing it. Some of the major contributors are continental philosophers. They're part of the canon, Claude Lévi-Strauss. So it's a little bit harder to characterize it, but perhaps there's some merit to that. What about characteristic methods? This is probably getting us closer to the heart of the difference. So these include basic attitudes towards arguments and texts. Maybe that is closer to the heart of the difference between continental and analytic philosophy. It would reflect how philosophy gets done, not only in its publications, but also how it gets done in the classroom, in formation, which is, I think, perhaps even more important than publication. How do you show people what philosophizing or doing philosophy looks like? Philosophy isn't something, I think, where you can have a easy book for how to do it that leads you through 10 easy steps. Just do these, right? It's something it's a skill that we get, or a set of skills that we get introduced to, again, as something like apprentices, and work our way towards something like mastery, but I'm not quite sure, if we can specify what that is. Here we can talk about distinctive movements or schools, though, arising in continental and analytic philosophy. This is an important distinction. Let's say we take continental philosophy, because that one's a lot easier to focus on. Is there a continental approach? Is there one basic approach that undergirds, let's not even say all, just most continental philosophy? Let's say we don't even worry about how it's done today, just its key figures. I see some shaking heads. Why not? Can't we say, well, they love texts. They believe in, doing critical reading of texts. Well, not all of them do. I mean, some certainly do. You don't recognize a text after Hegel has digested it, I can tell you that. Because in his really interesting works like the Phenomenology, he doesn't even name who he's talking about. You'd have to figure out the allusions yourself. And in his lectures, some of some of what goes into Hegel's mill comes out looking very different than the people he names by it. So, the Stoics, as Hegel finishes with them, don't look that much like Stoicism. Heidegger certainly loved texts. He talks an awful lot about that, and people who are interested in Heidegger do. What about Husserl? Was Husserl into reading texts? Husserl would begin each day by doing these extraordinarily detailed, and from my perspective, I'll probably get in trouble with a few people saying this, incredibly boring analysis, phenomenological descriptions that exist in the Husserl archive. And if you want to be a Husserl scholar, you go over there, you learn to read his shorthand, and then you study some of these that nobody else has read before, and you write a little monograph on it. And that's very different than say, Heideggerian hermeneutics of texts. I don't think there is one single approach that you can point to. There's a lot of different sub-movements within continental philosophy. What about analytic philosophy, then? Is there something that we can say today, maybe in the past we could, But is there something today that we can say constitutes the analytic approach? You guys are analytic philosophers, or analytic philosophers in training. What would you say? I would say no, but I'm in a less qualified position to say anything about that.
What you have here on the handout is a good place to start. You have on the analytic side, provides analysis of concepts, arguments, intuitions, uses of language.
Yeah.
I feel like I can understand what that is, but when I look on the Continental side, it says provides descriptions of experience, textual analysis, critique, or liberation. And on the analytic side, I recognize that as philosophical methods.
Yeah.
But on the Continental side, it looks, you were talking about textual analysis. And
Yeah.
that strikes me as something either narrowly conceptualized as something you would do studying literature, or more broadly, it's something that any academic would do to analyze texts.
Well, not any academic, because you're not going to find that many people in the natural sciences doing that. But yeah, in general, you're right.
Yeah, what I mean is there's a broad and a narrow way of thinking of textual analysis. I think I analyze texts when I read them.
Yeah.
But I don't know that I practice continental philosophy.
Well, it's interesting, too, because different groups within continental philosophy don't mean the same things by analyzing texts. Like a Marxist is looking for certain things. Somebody who's working within a broadly, psychoanalytic tradition is looking for other things. Some of them didn't analyze texts at all. Mm-hmm. They just wrote their own stuff.
But I guess what I wanted to ask you is actually, and from my perspective, I think I would like to admit my perspective is biased in some ways, but it strikes me that the methods of analytic philosophy, as simplified here, has a unity and a coherence to it, but I don't understand if there is a method of continental philosophy.
I don't think there is. Yeah. I think there's methods.
Methods, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure that there is today a method for analytic philosophy. This is a simplification.
Yeah, the generalities. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, because you look at the history of you read the analytic texts, the core texts for their history, and often they don't have that much in common with each other. As far as the method goes, we can say that they are broadly engaging in some kind of attempt to provide arguments, and, be clear about things. But that's about as far as we get, I think. And it's really interesting to me, moving in the kinds of circles that I do, that when I talk with my analytic friends and colleagues in one area, what I find about what they're doing or interested in doesn't carry forth into another area. That's why some people talk about this being a post-analytic period, where even the vocabulary, although the same term will be used, like externalism and internalism, means something very different in one area, like philosophy of action, as it does in another area. And so, from my perspective, historically, it ends up looking a lot like some of the things we used to say about scholasticism, where concentration on working with terms that have been essentially, they're neologisms coined in order to carry out work, and they don't always translate from one side to the other. So I think that analytic philosophy is in a different condition than it was, like back when I was in my philosophical formation. And I don't know. I have no idea where it's going to go myself, because I'm not really qualified to say that. But it does seem like it's harder and harder to find a substantive common core to an analytic method or an analytic approach. These generalities, like being clear. What does it mean to be clear? So there's a, if we want to be kind of joking, there's a bit of obscurity about that. There's also, I brought up the aims of philosophy itself. And maybe that's a way to differentiate between them. I'm not really sure if it works well. Some of these are like what we're talking about, clarity and presentation, mainly through focus on the structure of arguments. That's something the analytics seem to be particularly good at. Adequately setting up an author's position and contributions before engaging in critique and suggesting further lines to explore. Some continental philosophers are very good at that. Some of them are very, very bad at that. Then there's sort of grander scale things, and I think that these tend to be more associated with continental philosophy, like, overcoming Western metaphysics is a big project, which, by the way, I don't think anybody really knows what that means at this point. It's meant so many different things. But that's very clearly something different than what many analytic philosophers would want to talk about. But we can talk about things that pop up in analytic philosophy. There is a lot in analytic philosophy of religion, there's a lot of work done by theistic philosophers. That's essentially what we used to call apologetics, aimed at demonstrating the rationality of religious faith or doctrines. Not so much of that in continental these days, in part because continental philosophy isn't all European philosophy. It's just sort of a subsector of it. But you see that it can be quite difficult to characterize these. But let's try a little bit more with the analytic philosophy. So maybe we put aside the location stuff. Maybe looking at its history might prove useful. What's sort of the doctrine about where did analytic philosophy come from? Why did it emerge as a movement?
My understanding is that it started with Frege and Russell creating basically predicate logic. Yeah, now notice that by talking about it that way, you focused already on two of the key thinkers in it, and a very important movement within it. Russell wasn't just motivated to do logic. You said Frege was, I think. And he had some interesting motives for what he was doing, as it turned out later on. Why did Russell get into it? He didn't love logic just for its own sake. It was a reaction against something. Does anybody know what they were reacting against? No?
British idealism?
Yeah. Now, what does that mean? That was
It means I'm good at reading.
Oh. Did I put that on there? I forgot. Yeah. Okay. So these were Hegelians. These were people. We kind of forget how Hegel and continental philosophy is a total aside. Hegel and continental philosophy is primarily coming from engagement with his phenomenology of spirit, and primarily with one subsection of it called the master-slave dialectic. And some thinkers like Slavoj Žižek actually read the whole text. Most read just a portion of it. And in the 19th century, that book wasn't really read much. People weren't that interested in that. They were much more interested in his logic and his system capital S, which was supposed to take in everything. And so there were these British idealists who were doing similar projects. They're very interesting people to read. Some of them had some interesting insights, but they would talk in pretty murky terms. The absolute winds up being everywhere. Russell, understandably, wanted to know what are they actually talking about. Thought a lot of what they were saying was kind of vacuous. And so the ideal behind focusing on logic is we can rebuild things from the ground up, and that's what you call the logists project, as Russell and Whitehead originally conceived of it. And that's a very important beginning point in analytic philosophy. The early Wittgenstein kind of fits into that in a weird, eccentric way. He's sort of like a comet coming in and just going on his own orbit. There were advances in mathematics and logic and understanding of language that were underway. Great promise involved in that. And another thing to understand historically is the importance of other philosophical movements in the background. It's not as if they totally rejected all, previous philosophy. The positivist movement itself is going to show up again in logical positivism, which didn't, there's a reason why it's positivism.
The 19th century saw some pretty important thinkers in that respect. Analytic ethics, think about G. Moore, who was he primarily concerned in dealing with, the utilitarians. That whole thing provides a background. And then, in some ways, analytic philosophy saw itself early on as a continuance of the empiricist project. There's references, not a lot of direct references, but thinking out things in terms of Mill and Hume, an emphasis on what can actually be empirically attested or verified, as we see in the verificationist attempt, and all that. And it continues its development throughout the 20th century within a tradition with some very interesting work done. There's a whole bunch of other, you might say, spin-off projects or ways of doing things. Think about how different, if you've read Russell's philosophy of logical atomism, and then you compare that to Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, they really are quite different stuff. Or you compare either of those to somebody like Ryle writing later on, continuing this analysis, focusing on ordinary language, really quite distinct movements developing, and it continues on. So by the time that I'm in graduate school, the whole discussion about possible worlds had become part of the parlance, and it was something that we were getting introduced to. It was very, very interesting stuff as well. Now, analytic philosophy effectively becomes dominant in the Anglosphere and in Scandinavia. How does it identify itself? Is it by reference to this canon? How many of you would say, and I'm not trying to put anybody on the spot, so just think about this. How many of you would say that you really engage the canon of classic analytic philosophical texts on a continuing basis? That you see that as important? Do you see it as important? Or is it something that can be successfully left behind? Like, Wittgenstein's old metaphor of the ladder that you pull up, which he got, I think, out of, if I remember right, some mystic text in the Christian tradition. Now, why wouldn't a canon be important?
If it's more focused on natural sciences, natural logic, and because you can observe, then you can use those systems that you can observe.
Yeah.
It just works through other writers.
Yeah.
Or use things outside of what humans wrote.
Say that last one again.
Or use things outside of what humans wrote.
Oh yeah. Well, I don't. There's nobody in the classic literature who's sort of like quoting Hume chapter and verse and saying, "Here's how we."
I mean, like humans, like people.
Oh, humans. Okay. Sorry, I said Hume. Although they really did. If you look back on that literature, they did raise some really central issues and suggest some trajectories. Some of which they later on rejected. A.J. Ayer, by the way, is a great person for. You look at what he said in his later years about his earlier work. He said almost all of it was wrong, but it was great that he did it. Do you need reference points, or maybe that's no longer important?
Yeah, I was. The names attached to the ideas seem less important to me.
You mean like the movements, or?
No, the specific authors.
Okay.
Knowing that an article I'm reading came from Russell might be useful for getting to understand exactly what he's talking about, because Russell has a specific way of talking.
Yeah.
But more important to me are the central themes and the time period, the conversation going on in philosophy at the time. So the canon is important insofar as it's useful to learn about what is happening in philosophy right now, or what was happening previously, what ideas emerged, but the ideas are more important to me than the actual text.
Yeah, or the claims, you might say.
Yeah, the claims, the arguments, the concepts.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And we might be at a point, too, where enough, like, sub-literatures have grown up
by the way, too, this is one of the things I'll talk about towards the end. We're in a different situation as well as far as time, where it's not really possible to master some sort of comprehensive canon of contemporary analytic philosophy, because there's just so much stuff out there, any more than you could with Continental. But I'll talk about why that matters in a bit. What do you guys make of sort of, you might say that I'm not sure how to describe it, but there are many people working within analytic philosophy who are coming in from other substantive philosophical traditions, like analytic Thomists, the people who are coming out of Stump's school, who take they're doing something, taking Thomas Aquinas and sometimes some others, and trying to put it into an analytic thing. Robert Brandom is trying to do that with Hegel. I'm not sure how successfully, because I haven't really read his stuff. There's analytic Marxists out there who there's a big going project for a while. They want to take Marx, who's pretty obscure in points, and take his arguments and put them into an analytic framework. It would seem that there must be something pretty definitive about the analytic framework in order to do that.
It's a formula that you learn, and then you can take the formula and apply it to other places. I haven't studied analytics.
I don't know. I don't.
I get the impression of logic. You learn how to do logic, and then you take it and you use it. You find out who the person was that taught you logic.
But analytic philosophy is much more than just the application of logic. There is like the sort of having to parse out what arguments are. I'm sure you can put arguments into a logical form. That used to be very popular, by the way, when I was in formation. The analytics would spend a lot of time putting things into a formal logic notation and then translating them back again and saying, okay, this is what we did. And we'd be like, well, why did you do that? I think nowadays it is still done. I'm going on very limited experience because I don't read as much analytic philosophy, especially contemporary stuff, as I'd like to. But I get the idea that there's much more just let's try to make things clear and present them in a way that then we can see whether they stand up or not just putting them into a logical form. I can say this as somebody who studied St. Thomas. Myself, I don't really find what the analytic Thomists do to be very rooted in Thomas after a while. It looks much more like doing analytic philosophy with a little bit of Thomas thrown in than doing anything substantively Thomistic. But I'm sure they see it very different. There's one other thing too I'd like to say about analytic philosophy, as we're trying to sort of work that out. There are some analytic philosophers who are excellent historians of philosophy, who have made some major contributions. Gregory Vlastos in Plato scholarship, prime example. Some of the people who I read, and I do a lot of work on Anselm, have done some really interesting work as well. That's probably enough at this point about analytic, because it's sort of like preaching to the choir here. What about continental philosophy? I don't think there is any such thing as continental philosophy in a strict sense, myself, because there isn't one single coherent perspective to it. And I will admit, too, there is what we could call a continental shtick, or a repertoire. If you go in some continental circles or read certain journals, and it's not just confined to students, but it's often found among some professors where they just use some jargon, invoke some key doctrines. It used to be very popular when I was a graduate student that we had to deconstruct everything. Now it's much more in terms of rhizome, and if you ask people what does that mean, they'll tell you about grass and roots, but there isn't a lot. There are some people who do it really well. Those people are pretty rare. There's a lot more people just talking about this sort of stuff than doing something, I would say, that's very rigorous. Historically, I would say the existence of what we call continental philosophy is the product of a history. Prior to analytic philosophy attaining dominance in Britain and America, there used to be a lot of interaction and influence between French and German and English-speaking philosophical circles. And you can see this reflected, just look at, correspondence between people like James and Bergson, for an example. Then there was also a stronger focus on figures in the history of philosophy. So that allowed kind of a shared, formation, you could say, or a shared set of reference points. With the rise of analytic philosophy in Britain and the United States, there was much less of that. There was a tendency to set aside non-analytic philosophers as sort of unimportant, as merely historical, as not really philosophy, but something masquerading as philosophy. Ryle was a great example of making those sort of claims as he engaged in an attempt to try to have a dialogue with continental philosophers. The newer continental thought made its way into the American academic scene in significant part through two main sources. One was Catholic schools, because there had been a long-standing connection, and they went. Some of them have gone analytic. Many of them went analytic fairly late, and then also sort of radical schools like the New School in New York, right? Eventually, like in 1962, you see the Society for Phenomenological and Existential Philosophy being created as sort of a counterweight to the APA, which was felt to be so analytic and so hostile to continental philosophy that they wanted to have their own space. I'm not sure that was really the case. Looking back at it historically, there were still panels on people in the continental tradition at the APA, and I'm not sure that that's really the case quite so much today. But there was, for a while, kind of this rivalry. And there ends up being sort of, this goes to like why it would be more oriented with literature and with other humanities fields or studies fields, right? There's a lot of interconnections and overlaps with other movements like Marxism, feminism, Africana philosophy, and there's a lot of tie-ins with other fields as well. So what ends up developing is a kind of sense of opposition, of being an alternative, of philosophy being in a crisis, and the analytics are not, doing a good job with philosophy. They're actually, maybe doing anti-philosophy. This is the kind of stuff people talked about quite a bit when I was in graduate school. The idea was that by doing continental philosophy, you were doing something that was restoring philosophy to what it was supposed to be. Continental philosophy, as we understand it here, is really, I would say, more of an Anglo-American thing than what actually happens in Europe. It's a pretty selective cross-section of European philosophy, leaving out a lot of contemporary people who aren't, fitting into that vein, historically leaving out a lot of people as well. And even with that, even with confining it like that, I still don't think there's an internal coherence to it. I think it's more something defined by opposition to analytic philosophy, because we can say that there are a lot of different approaches within continental philosophy. So, it used to be that we would talk in terms of the 3 H's of phenomenology. Who would those be? Three H guys.
Searle, Heidegger, and Hegel.
Yeah, very good. And now if you actually read them, you find out that they mean very different things by phenomenology. Even Heidegger and Husserl, there's a huge difference between them and in their approach. Another way that we would talk about it sometimes is the hermeneutics of suspicion. Paul Ricoeur came up with this great phrase, and he said that continental philosophy has an attitude of suspicion, of demasking, of pulling back the veil from things. And so he talked about Marx doing so with economic life, Freud doing so with desire and sexuality, Nietzsche doing so with power and all sorts of other things. Another way you might think about it is, I don't know if any of you have ever seen Richard Kearney's pretty decent continental philosophy reader. Have any of you ever seen that in a bookstore? It's kind of a standard text for continental philosophy classes, and it covers the 20th century. So he divides it into three main groups. He has from phenomenology to hermeneutics. There is historically a continuity there, starting out with Husserl, going to Ricoeur. There's some continuity, although he leaves out quite a few of the people who would fit in there. Marxism to critical theory, okay, that makes sense too if you know what those are teaching. And then from structuralism to deconstruction, that's the kitchen sink, or the junk drawer rather. You know the junk drawer. Any of you had that? It's the miscellaneous drawer. Anytime you have a classification, or those of you who do budgets, I don't have to tell any of you who actually do budgets, always have a miscellaneous expenses category. Because everything that you can't fit into the other ones, that goes in there, right? That's that category, structuralism to deconstruction. That's everybody from de Saussure to Derrida and a whole bunch of other people in between who don't really have much in common with each other methodologically. And a lot ends up being left out in any attempt to corral in figures that we take to be continental philosophy. And it's also important to point out that while there are some philosophers who place themselves in they self-identify as continental philosophers, and they can say very well-informed things about and applying the key ideas and approaches of many of the canonical thinkers. That's a tough task. It's very difficult to survey the field of even official, we might call it official continental philosophy, and to be proficient in all those thinkers. So it's more the exception than the rule. There tends to be a lot of specialization among continental philosophers. And it's similar in analytic philosophy, right? People specialize in this area rather than that area. In this case, it's more often in terms of texts and thinkers. So somebody might, for example, say that they're a phenomenologist and they focus on Edmund Husserl and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and they'll know some basic ideas of Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre and Levinas and Marion, because those are people that you're probably going to have to teach and people still talk about, but they will never have read more than snippets of other major phenomenologists who are, there's quite a big literature on, like Max Scheler or Edith Stein or Gabriel Marcel or Dietrich von Hildenbrand, just to name a few. Now, that's just in phenomenology. That's not even talking about, say, hermeneutics or psychoanalytic theory, or, we can add more and more and more. There's a lot of this specialization. Some people even just specialize in one text of a major thinker. I only work on this later work of Heidegger. Don't ask me about being in time. So I'd like to point out that within this wide spectrum that we're defining as continental philosophy, there's some really varied attitudes towards philosophy's history. Some of these thinkers just seem to kind of mine the past thinkers and texts for ideas. They strip them out of their context. They're only interested in them insofar as they're part of some, you might say, liberatory agenda. Gilles Deleuze is a great example of somebody like that, I would say. Some situate their own work through some really serious and thoughtful engagement of their continuity with past thinkers. Somebody who's a contemporary example of that, I would say, would be Giorgio Agamben, if you've ever read his stuff. When he teaches classes, he's teaching Aristotle and Augustine, and he's placing his thought, Hobbes a lot, he places his thought in continuity with the past. Some see the past thought as something to overcome. Heidegger, you could say, saw things that way. We should also point out, too, that there's a lot of crosstalk and critique among continental thinkers. They can often be tougher on each other than they are towards any analytic, because it's sort of like a family battle. So is there any sort of essence that we can point to as continental philosophy? I don't think so. I mean, did any of you, after all those sort of talking points, see anything in there that we could find an essence or a characterization? Maybe even, everyone knows about Wittgenstein and family resemblance, right? games. There's lots of different kinds of games. That's the closest we're going to come to for what continental philosophy counts as. So I don't know that this chart is actually that useful in some respects. Now, what about the divide then? What happens to it? Clearly, there is some difference between analytic and continental philosophy. So, what are the differences? Well, there's a difference in who is considered worth reading and thinking about, and how one ought to read and think about them. What one's motive is for reading them. Right? That's part of it. There's clearly stylistic differences. Does an article in a primarily analytic journal read like something that you'd find in a primarily continental journal? Not usually. Maybe they sneak something in every once in a while. I don't know. We'd have to do a survey. So there are stylistic differences. We can talk about different dialects or idioms, perhaps, of philosophical discourse. And there's geographical and departmental differences. Some places, it's primarily analytic. Some places it's primarily continental. You always have to ask with continental, what kind of continental, because they don't always get along and agree with each other. But one thing I'd like to point out and stress again, there's gaps and divides within analytic and continental philosophy themselves. So there's a gap between the present and the past. I think that if you were to ask 40 years ago about a canon of analytic philosophy, or even when I was in graduate school, if you were a student studying analytic philosophy, you actually read the canon of analytic philosophy. You may afterwards say, I'm not going to bother with these guys because I'm just doing, possible world stuff. But you would read it and maybe have to respond to it. I don't think that's necessarily the case these days, is it? What about continental philosophy? There's a huge gap between the present of continental philosophy and its past. I think in some ways, and again, I'm probably going to provoke some reaction from viewers with this, I think it was done in more serious ways in the past by some of the thinkers than it's being done by some of them today. There's also gaps in the present. And we already talked about that with continental philosophy. Marxists and psychoanalysts don't always get along. Just to pick a few things, Marxists and phenomenologists usually. That's a great one. Phenomenologists, anybody, oftentimes. What about an analytic philosophy? And I don't mean things like having schools facing off against each other. Let me ask you this: does somebody who is working in ethics broadly construed in the analytic tradition, do they share the same or even an overlapping reading list with somebody doing epistemology or metaphysics?
Yeah, absolutely.
You think so?
Yeah.
You think they all read the same articles?
No, but there's a significant overlap.
Okay.
If you're thinking Venn diagrams, of course there's lots of stuff that they read different, but there's a core that they are all going to read.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I don't find that to be the case among a lot of my younger analytic peers. But I probably know much less about that because my sample size is smaller. It looks to me as if there's growing divergences between different discourses within analytic philosophy, and they're not actually reading each other. And sometimes the language, the same terminology doesn't mean the same thing going from discourse to discourse, so it always has to be defined.
Can I just ask a question about that?
Absolutely.
That's absolutely right. The word externalism gets used different ways in different subdisciplines. Libertarianism means one thing when you're talking about free will and something else when you're talking about political philosophy.
Yeah.
Right? But why isn't that just a simple case of ambiguity? It's not.
A simple case of
words all the time,
sure.
right? And anybody who works on free will and political philosophy just knows, okay, when I'm doing political philosophy, I mean one thing by libertarianism. When I'm doing free will, I mean something else by it. There's no.
Yeah, and generally they have to specify that at the beginning when they use the term. You're right. I don't see that as just by itself being, how these different fields are different. I think it's just a sign of how divergent they end up becoming.
Right. But I mean, it's not an impediment to communication between these fields, right? People
In theory, you're right, yeah. I think that there's a lot of what's happening over here ends up just going its own way, and what's happening over here ends up having very little connection with it. Other than they're using some sort of broadly analytic approach to it,
Can I ask a different question?
Yeah,
I probably should have asked an hour ago.
Sure.
So it's always seemed to me that that the term analytic, as it's used in philosophy, is ambiguous in a way that's very analogous to the way the word classical is used in music, right? So sometimes when you're talking to serious musicians, they'll say, well, what I mean by classical music is a very distinctive style, typified by Mozart that was prevalent in the late 18th century and very early 19th century in Vienna, and that's classical music, right?
Okay.
And Mussorgsky is not a classical musician, right? And neither is Rachmaninoff, and so on.
Yeah.
But there's this other much broader use where what most of us mean by classical music is just sort of highbrow music.
Yeah. So it includes everything from Baroque to contemporary stuff.
And I think
so long as there's like violins in it.
Yeah, stuff like that. Yeah, French horn or something.
The composer has a Russian or German name.
Yeah. Well, not necessarily.
Okay,
so in philosophy, there is this very somewhat narrowly construed notion of analytic philosophy, which is the analysis of concepts and language, which we associate with Ryle and Austin and people like that.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty well-defined thing, but reasonably. I mean, I'm not saying we can give necessary and sufficient conditions, but I mean, we can all identify what counts as that.
Yeah.
But there's this much broader sense. I mean, you said this is an analytic department, and I think that's a fair characterization, but not in that narrow sense.
Right. Yeah.
Right. We're analytic in the way that Rachmaninoff is classical.
Yeah. Well, I mean that style of, let's call it analytic one.
Yeah.
It's just not it hasn't been a going concern for a long time.
Yeah. So what is this broader thing? Well, look, as with classical music in the broad sense, you can't give precise identity conditions for it, but you can recognize it pretty well. And as you said, it has a lot to do with giving arguments, striving, often failing, but striving for clarity and for cogency.
Yeah.
Right. I don't see. So. Does continental philosophy? How does continental philosophy fit into that? Well, I don't know. I mean, some of it probably is that condition.
Oh yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, that's one of the things that people have been writing on this point out. Like in terms of like Husserl, for example, you want some very detailed analyses of not so much of language, although he did do some stuff with language. He does that. There are some continental philosophers who've made, I was going to talk about this a bit later, made a great effort to try to reach across the gap or the divide and frame things in ways that would aim for clarity. Not always achieving it. I mean, Habermas is a great example. I don't think Habermas is extraordinarily clear, but I think he's striving for that.
I agree.
Yeah, about him striving or about him not?
About striving. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Habermas is worth reading. I've read some of his stuff. I mean, what my thought about Habermas is that insofar as I have been able to make sense of most of what he said, I think it makes perfect sense, and it's not all that interesting. I mean, once you pare it down and get down to what he's really saying, it turns out to be fairly trivial.
Yeah. Well, we could come up with, I think, many examples of that.
Yeah.
So let's go back to this issue of the divide and how it fits in. So let's say that there is some common core and approach to the analytic philosophy. I think that at this point the divide has become more, as they say, sociological than rooted in some sort of essential difference. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or that it's going to go away. I think the biggest factor, as I'm going to talk about a bit later, is actually time and the requirements that time would impose on us. The history of the divide, you do have to admit, has involved a lot of unnecessary bashing, misrepresentations, even attempts to push out the other sides from institutional spaces. One of the graduate schools that I applied to when I was applying for graduate school back in '94 actually sent me a letter back saying, we're no longer, for the time being, we don't have a graduate program. And as it turned out, they had a big fight, the way it sometimes happens, and the analytics were forced out by the Continentals. And they lost so many faculty that for the time being, they had to curtail accepting any new graduate students. That sort of thing has been the case in the past. I think, and I don't know, whether this is really the case, but I think that it's much less common now. That there is some recognition of pluralism. I think that from a historical perspective, if we look at it as a genuine rivalry, it doesn't seem to be anything necessary to philosophy itself. It's not necessary for the present time. But there are some historically created gaps of understanding between analytic and continental formed philosophers. But the other thing I'd like to say too is the notion of them sort of carving up the available space that gets put out there, and in charts like this, I think is very parochial. It ignores all the other stuff that there is to do in philosophy, and that is getting done. Now, granted, I would say American philosophy departments are, for the most part, either analytic or continentally oriented, although there are some ones that really do focus on classical American philosophy or doing history of philosophy extraordinarily well. So how might we view this divide then? I would say we should understand it as an important feature of the contemporary and likely future philosophical scene, but we want to broaden our horizons beyond it. And we should look for models provided by thinkers like Habermas, for example, who try to make genuine efforts to bridge this divide. Somebody who I would point to in the history of analytic philosophy who did that, and I think did that quite well, but not in a systematic way, was John Wisdom, who is kind of a minor figure, but very, very interesting to read. He thought that he would, take a look at what Sartre was writing and see if there was anything to it. He was interested in psychoanalysis. So, you see somebody actually trying to do that. Paul Ricoeur, great example. If you ever read The Rule of Metaphor, he's explicitly engaging contemporary analytic philosophy of language. And then I'd say there's some interesting defectors as well that are worth taking a look at. One of these is Richard Rorty, who starts out in analytic philosophy and then eventually does his own thing. I don't, they want to say that he's like, in the American pragmatist tradition, but I don't really know about that. I think he's more doing his own thing, informed by some things from analytic philosophy, some things from American pragmatism, and informed by some things from continental philosophy. Another one, Alasdair MacIntyre. Alasdair MacIntyre gets a start in analytic philosophy. He's clearly not an analytic philosopher, but he's clearly not a continental philosopher either. He is doing something that he calls tradition-constituted rationality. That whether he gets his history of philosophy right or not, he's been criticized by the Kierkegaard scholars about his Kierkegaard. He's been criticized by the Stoic scholars about his views on Stoicism. So there are some, he is at least trying to think in a historical perspective. So let's talk then about what I was supposed to talk about. What can analytic and continental philosophers learn from each other? And there's a number of ways we can answer this for present-day philosophers. We can say, what can analytic philosophers learn from reading philosophers within the continental canon and vice versa? What can analytic philosophers learn from reading contemporary continental philosophers, including secondary literature or adaptations, and vice versa? What can analytic philosophers learn by engaging in dialogue and discussion with continental philosophers? And what can continental philosophers learn by that? And then what more general features characteristic of both could be learned? And if you ask these questions and you really try to answer them, there's a presumption that something non-trivial is there to be learned from each other. That no one approach totally monopolizes what counts as philosophy. So maybe you find something that supplements your way of engaging in philosophy. Now, it should be unsurprising at this point that my answers are going to suggest that some of the things that can be learned are not exclusive to analytic or continental philosophers, but to other approaches as well. So general features. When I thought about this, the approach and the style of analytics. So analytic philosophy does in general get done with this guiding ideal of clear, well-organized prose, Not just arguments, but clear, well-organized prose, which I think is important. Providing explicitly worked-out arguments, identifying what might be questionable assumptions or intuitions. Could continental philosophers benefit by trying to adopt that idiom? I think they probably could, many of them. I think some of them, in doing so, would discover that their research project turned out to be a failure. And so, there's a lot of engaging in obscurity, because it prevents one from having to say there's really not much here. But it would be good as well for seeing what really is there. At the very least, it's a useful exercise to try to translate what one wants to say into a different style or idiom, I think. Analytic philosophers, when they're doing their work well, are quite selective in engagement with literature and their topic. Here's one of what I consider a strength of analytic philosophy. When they make references to literature, like, say, footnoting, it's usually relevant and centrally relevant, not just tangentially relevant. That would also be useful for some continental philosophers to consider as a writing tip, right? Now, going the other way, some continental philosophers have a really robust engagement with thinkers and texts, and they aim at systematically understanding a philosophical perspective as they engage with it, not only in its own terms, but also in terms of its context and structure and relevance. And I think that can be useful for analytic philosophers to acquire as a skill, learning how to read texts, not just in terms of dissociated claims and arguments. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but you lose a lot by doing that. And continental philosophers are also, you might say, more, let's just call it adventurous in their choice of subject matter and what they're willing to draw upon. Although I think, if we look at more recent analytic philosophy, it's harder to say that, there's huge areas of human experience that are being left out because there's so much work being done. But I think that, looking at some of the examples could be useful for them. I think both sides genuinely engaging each other helps to overcome a kind of, not closed-mindedness, but, having blinders on, only seeing a very small portion of philosophy, an assumption that only one mode is legitimate. And I actually would like to use sort of an analogy to what Descartes says in his Discourse on Method. He suggests that travel is a really great idea. He had been a fan of the gap year, right? The term that people use these days for the year that you're not in school. And the reason he was really a fan of that, other than the fact that he had enough money to travel, I think, is that he said that by watching people, you get to see how they engage in reasoning about their world. You get to see a whole bunch of other perspectives in action. And he thought that was a good thing. He thought you couldn't do that so much from books. I think he's probably wrong about that. I think looking at how other people do philosophy could be quite useful. And it breaks us free from a kind of, you might say, conformity that can be restrictive at times. So that could be a value that's centrally involved in philosophy. I know it has been in the past. That we talk as if, when we're introducing it to undergraduates, as if that's what philosophy does. So that could be good. What about reading each other's canonical figures? Now, what are recognized as classic texts and important thinkers are usually worth reading, at least in my experience, for both the continental figures and analytic figures. But then again, I really enjoy reading philosophical texts. What can you do through that? You can get introduced to alternative philosophical perspectives and themes, ideas that some really intelligent people took seriously and found worth thinking through. It also saves a bit of time from reinventing wheels. This is one of my complaints as I engage sometimes with colleagues doing things like virtue epistemology, which is primarily an analytic concern. They'll do a lot of work, and then you'll say, "Yeah, Aristotle already did that." Now we're not talking about Aristotle, but continental philosophy. there's some things I think where it could be good to get ideas from continental thinkers, and I think this is what Ricoeur recognized in the rule of metaphor. Sometimes the analytics are way ahead of the continentals on some important things like how to understand metaphor. You can also understand or ascertain limitations or failures in those texts for yourself rather than relying on secondary glosses. If you want to know whether Hegel is indecipherable, read Hegel. And then, it won't take long before you're getting that impression. And I'm saying this as somebody who likes Hegel. If you want to see whether Heidegger is really onto something or not, you probably got to read some Heidegger. And actually read it, not just sort of, skim through it, but see what's there. You can see where the problem of time is starting to raise its head, though, right? What about contemporary literature? I think you can say a lot of the same things about contemporary literature. The problem is there's too much of it. There's way more being churned out, and it's tougher to see what in it is classic, because every book jacket says that this is the best text ever that came out. So it's hard to say exactly where you would go for guidance on that. And we do have to admit, philosophy can be a little bit fad or fashion-driven at times. So that can be an issue. And what about dialogue or collaboration? I think it's useful to learn who matters to one's interlocutors and why, what value they have, what do they see in them. And then learning how to speak, it's sort of like learning how to speak a different dialect or perhaps even a different language in our discipline. Now, I think, and here's where I'm going to put in my own 2 cents, much of what's particularly valuable that either side can learn from each other is something they can learn from other main ways of doing philosophy as well. If you want a clear exposition focused on setting out and critically analyzing arguments, analytic philosophy doesn't have a lock on that. All you got to do is read Thomists. Some of them were real experts in that. Some of them not so much. You can also find this in a lot of historically focused work. If you want to see a focus on broader historical or social, contexts, you might get that better from historical approaches than from contemporary continental philosophy. And there are a lot of people out there who do work, in historical figures, who are taking them very seriously. The people who are Aristotle scholars are writing on Aristotle because they think there's something really there, and they read the whole corpus, not just portions of it. You're not going to find a lot of, well, you will find one person I can think of, Agamben, who takes Aristotle seriously, but not too many others among continental thinkers. Learning how to read classic works and authors, not only pre-19th or 20th century, but even those authors who are considered to be analytic or continental thinkers, that's something else that, I think historians of philosophy are good at. Now, what is the biggest obstacle? I mentioned time. When you're studying in a particular place, you have to look to the people that you're studying with. If you want to broaden your horizons about that, how do you know who to go to? Any choice you're going to make is going to be something arbitrary, and every bit of research that you do requires that you pay out some time. And your time is limited. I know I was talking about this with Joseph. For younger people, and if I was saying this to my younger self, it feels like you have a lot of time. And actually, as students, you do have, in general, more time than professors do, because you don't know how much, nonsense professors have to put up with, quite frankly. And then, once you start having, families and things like that, that takes more time. But there's sort of like you might say, a horizon that kind of shifts around. We're not going to live forever. So when you're deciding who you're going to read, I think about it this way. If somebody proposes I should read some new text, I think, well, I could read this, or I could reread some Kant, or I could reread some Aristotle, or I could actually get to the Hegel stuff that I'm supposed to do, or I could read some, keep going on and on and on. You can't do it all. So, in terms of overcoming this divide, in theory, we could, if we had infinite time, we could all be on both sides of the divide and doing all kinds of philosophy. But that's not really a practical option. for us. So we have to do something almost like triage. We have to decide what we want to put our time into. So that's actually one reason why I came up with this reading list, which is, I think, more for the students than anyone else. This would be for if you wanted to get a decent, not a great, but decent smattering of fairly typical continental approaches with some works that are seen as being pretty important and are also short for the most part and fairly accessible. Some of them less than others, Baudrillard, Deleuze, not super accessible. This might be where you would start. And I picked 20 because 20 is a convenient number, and you gotta have a cutoff somewhere. But I thought these would be useful. You notice I don't have Hegel's anything in there. We do have, Kojève's introduction to the reading of Hegel. I think that is when you read Kojève, you're getting more Kojève than Hegel, but you're at least getting some Hegel in a digested form. And there's a lot of, you notice also like Jacques Lacan, I don't recommend anybody reads the Écrit to start with because he's deliberately obscure. And he said so. He said he's going to make people work as hard as they could to understand that stuff. That doesn't strike me as a virtue of his work. Seminar 7, like many of his seminars, pretty straightforward. There's some challenging stuff in there, but it's much more straightforward than his deliberately difficult parts. And so this could be what you would want to do. But now imagine to yourself, let's say you did say, okay, I'm going to do this. How long would this take? Just to go through these 20 works. Could you do it in a semester? Maybe if you didn't have anything else to do. If you were just reading these. So you have to make choices about what you would want to draw upon. And that's going to, when we say what can analytic and continental philosophers learn from each other, that's going to be somewhat limited by this factor of time, more than anything else. I think more than the existence of a divide, more than the history of, squabbles between people, we are in a situation where that's the toughest factor for us to deal with. And I think for those of us who are older, and especially those of us who've passed the point where we say, well, more than half my life is probably done statistically, it becomes very pressing. I don't know. Maybe I'm generalizing too much from my own experience, but that's all I have as far as that issue. If you want, I can tell you a little bit about sort of reflections on this historical approach, or we could just do general Q&A if that's more interesting. I know that I said I would talk for about 90 minutes, and I've done that. You've been very patient. Listening for 90 minutes, that's a long time.
You guys have questions that you want to pose to?
I do. Characteristically, I want to fall into the subgroup, one of the subgroups you mentioned. And you have this emphasis on time where you can only study so much. Why is it not more so in the interest, despite the kind of sexist beginnings of philosophy, to study more feminist philosophy? I mean, it kind of be in your interest to study half the population that you share globally.
Yeah, I'm actually a fan of that. I do work on Mary Wollstonecraft. And if you look at the list that I've got here, there's quite a few women philosophers in there.
Just more so as like a general question of like philosophy, do you think that the problem is because of the beginnings and women were seen as more so inferior and not the rational sex, or do you think it's just
Well, what are you asking me?
In general, because at least from what I've observed, feminist philosophy isn't. I would arguably say it's not given its 2 cents.
I'd say that's generally true.
Yeah.
At this point in time. No, you're asking why that's the case?
Yeah. Would you say that it's the historical implications of philosophy that women can't do philosophy, or would you say?
Well, there's some of that. That was certainly an impulse for a long time, and there is still some sort of old boyism that goes on with that. I have to say that I myself, in the places where I've worked, haven't seen much of that, which is kind of nice. But I'm sure that we still have these big scandals that show up in the New York Times every once in a while. More at the level of institutions, I think that in part, one of the issues is that feminist theory and works by women doing, let's call it philosophy writ large, rather than just in one particular area, have often been pushed off to other departments, like women's studies. Well, we don't have to have a discussion of this because they can go take a class over there, or to English departments in particular. I teach Wollstonecraft when I teach intro and ethics classes sometimes. I'm probably pretty unusual in doing that, including among my female colleagues. Usually she'll get taught in a class on feminism or women and gender, or whatever it's named, right? And then she's just one example among many. What else? I mean, you asked if there's some historical basis for it. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that I do a lot of work on Aristotle, and I teach Aristotle every time I teach an ethics class. And usually when I'm teaching it, most places that I've taught, it's to a class that includes more women than men. And so, when we get to talking about his remarks about women, which are pretty poorly informed and have done some great historically have done some great damage in setting back, equality because of the way that he was used. I say this, if you think about Aristotle and his method in general, what would he do if we brought him into the classroom? He'd have some real culture shock to begin with. And then what if you pointed out to him that we're reading this text and it's primarily that the female students are actually raising their hands. Outcomes are worse in most college settings for male students. Retention rates are lower. Women tend to be doing better. What do you make of that, buddy? What do you think about that? I think Aristotle would probably say, well, I think I need to reconsider some of my statements and the premises that I was drawing them from, because clearly they're not well founded. And so it's probably going to take several generations just to say defang Aristotle, let alone others. But you've got somebody receptive here to having more women in the curriculum. When I teach Descartes, I include the correspondence with Elizabeth, who he treated as an equal. It's interesting too, because I'm doing a piece on Wollstonecraft as a virtue ethicist. Even in the virtue ethics community, she is, and in the history of philosophy, of moral philosophy community, almost no mention of her. Which is too bad. But that's a bit of a digression. Any other questions, or did that answer?
Yeah, it did.
Sufficiently? Okay. Yeah.
Do you think there's need for, and this kind of builds off of what you were discussing, do you think that there's some kind of need for almost a meta-philosophy to sort of start the conversation on what works from the different disciplines, continental, even Eastern philosophy, are worth delving into to start building sort of a more global philosophical school?
Well,
or do you think that we should just let it happen more naturally and let the sort of bridging of the divide happen as it does over time?
I think it's good to have efforts that are set in place to do that, and there are some going on. Some of that gets done under the rubric of comparative philosophy.
Okay.
And there are even grant programs there's money to take philosophers from the States and then bring them over to China and have some interaction. But it's a pretty small proportion of people that's affected. Any meta-philosophy is always going to be from somebody's perspective. So it's anytime you try to have some overarching thing, it's something that Somebody's going to run it, you know. I guess I'm sort of like, you know, very, very much influenced by somebody like Alistair McIntyre in that respect. You're never going to have some sort of clean, pure meta-philosophy where it's level playing field. Every philosophy actually is, every philosophical tradition is already a meta-philosophy because they've got a notion of what counts as philosophy, even if inchoate, and why those other guys over there aren't doing philosophy, you know. So in some sense they are. Now, should it be, we can ask two questions here. Would it be good for there to be more interchange? And then should we, like, you know, as philosophers, I don't know, as like, you know, speaking for other philosophers, should we be pushing that sort of thing? And I would say yes, and then I would leave that up to the people that are involved. Everybody's, you know, pretty busy and has a lot to do, and maybe it's enough to do it just in your own practice if you think it's an important thing to do, or maybe it's something that we should, you know, try to promote when we can. I would think that one way we can do it in a very easy way is just through collegiality. And that seems to be we seem to be in a much better position with respect to that than, say, 20 years ago or 40 years ago, where people were forcing each other out of departments. And, my mentor ended up teaching in prisons for a while because there was a while where they were trying to phase out the Continental Philosophers in SIU, and the way they did it was just by assigning them all prison classes. Now, he loved it, so it turned out great for him. I actually taught in prisons too, and very much enjoyed it. He didn't see it as a punishment, but it was intended as a punishment, an inducement to get the hell out of there. I don't see that, you know, if we can avoid that sort of stuff and call other people on it when they're doing it, I think that advances this mutual understanding. But it's very tough. I mean, that factor of time, we don't have time enough to read everybody's stuff, you know, even assuming we wanted to. And it's not as if we have a moral duty to do so, I think, you know. It's supererogatory, as they say, right?
I have a question about the time.
It is...
Good. Couldn't that give Analytic and Continental Philosophers more reason not to try to bridge the divide? If you point out how little time there is to engage with the literature.
And you add in the fact that it takes time to write your articles, to get tenure, to
make
do
sense
service.
Make sense of the other analytic philosophers as it is.
Oh, so that the time would be better spent understanding the other people just within your own field. Sort of like, you know, why should you, you know, look, if you've already got a tough family situation, you should focus on devote your activity to that. This is not the best analogy, but focus your activity on that. Don't worry about what's happening on the other end of town. They'll sort themselves out. Maybe after you get this taken care of, you can go. I guess one could say that. You know, just with continental philosophy, it would be nice to have the very unedifying activities of mutual, you know, recriminations and critiques that go on just within continental philosophy be a little bit more respectful and muted, which might be helped by actually reading each other's works rather than just saying, oh, those, you know, those Marxists or those phenomenologists or whatever. But yeah, I mean, again, I don't think anybody has a duty to learn from bridging the gap or anything like that. But it is a good thing, you know. I mean, just as a historian, if I had never read Anselm, I would have missed out on so much. And that may sound very strange to some of you. You know, if you maybe just only read the proslogium, but you read the corpus of his works. There's so much rich thought there, and you know, that was a bridging a gap because nobody was training me to read Anselm. It was something I had to decide to do on my own, and then I found people who on the other side were supportive of that. The Institute for St. Anselm Studies, for example. And we could come up with lots of individual examples like that, I think. It's probably not the best answer, but
I think there's
pretty messy.
another related need.
Okay.
My undergraduate degree is in philosophy, but I'm in the graduate school for urban regional planning, and we talk about ethics for less than an hour in one class.
Yeah.
And so I think it's very necessary somehow to get it into the other disciplines.
When I was at Fayetteville State University, I got involved in this, co-founding what we called the Ethics in Business Education Project. One of the reasons we did that was because they did not have a business ethics class at all. And they were I usually get this acronym mixed up, ASCB. They belong to that organization, which is sort of an elite thing among business schools. And that organization requires that for your 4-year reaccreditation, you have to demonstrate that you're actually teaching ethical theories and how to apply them to your students. So they brought in us philosophers, and they're like, hey, can you take a look at our rubrics and maybe tweak them a little bit? And it was sort of like if you buy a house and you think that maybe the front door needs to be fixed, and then you find the frame is messed up, and that's nothing compared to the floor and the furnace, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger, so it turned into a project. And it was great because, what we ended up doing was developing a model where the goal was not to have the usual thing where you bring in the philosophers as sort of the hired guns to teach the content on ethics that the business students, sit through and then are like, fine, now we can get to our real work. Instead, it's have it be across the curriculum, so it's reflected in each class. And business textbooks that have sections on ethics, especially management, sometimes it's crazy stuff. You take a look at it and you're like, I don't know where they got these ideas from, but this is they usually get utilitarianism right, but the other stuff is a little bit questionable. So you want to get that curriculum done well, and you also want to work with the educators themselves, the business professors, not to make them experts in ethics, but to bring them to an intermediary level so that they can talk about this stuff competently in classes when their students say, well, isn't that all subjective? So they know how to approach those things, and it makes such a huge impact on those students. And we could say similar things for all sorts of other programs as well. It's interesting too. From an institutional perspective, philosophers, this is a total digression at this point, but this is one of the things I think about. Philosophers are one of the best situated groups to participate in a whole bunch of collaborative activities. We are the experts in critical thinking. Other people do critical thinking. Some of them call things critical thinking that aren't critical thinking. We are the experts. If you look at the APA Delphi report, which is the gold standard in what counts as critical thinking, who signed off on it? It's mostly philosophers. We're the ones who teach that. We can be participating by helping the rest of the curricula. If they want to infuse critical thinking, we can help them do that. Ethics, we can help them do that as well, and should be doing that. Just engaging in practical reasoning on things. Sometimes bringing a philosopher in. This is one place too where it's better to bring in an analytic philosopher than a continental philosopher. The philosopher asks questions that need to be asked. I was just talking with Joseph about this. In continental philosophy, which often sort of overlaps with literature or English departments, I would get into these, I was doing continental philosophy for a while, but I was also hanging out with a lot of English people. And they would often get upset with me because, the way people would do things, they'd present something and everyone said, that's really cool. Maybe, you could take this a little bit further. There wasn't a lot of critical analysis. A lot of saying, I think you got this wrong. And here's why I think you got this wrong. And so they would see the philosophers as being kind of, boorish or particular or things like that. But that's a necessary function. That bringing in a philosopher will often get you somebody who can ask the right questions. Philosophers ought to be involved in academic administration. Philosophers ought to be involved in whatever you guys have here that does faculty development. Philosophers ought to be involved in that. Philosophers ought to be sitting on a whole bunch of committees because they can do so much really good work as philosophers. But you don't see a lot of that, unfortunately. I think in part because it's not just because philosophers aren't volunteering to do it. I think there's a bit of a pushback. But there's so much potential for philosophers because of the training that we have to do great work in academic institutions and in outside institutions.
So to make it relevant more specifically to today, you did mention it in there saying that the analytic side is probably more useful for translating or moving outside of the discipline specifically into other disciplines. Are those skills going to be more useful to broaden the exposure of philosophy to other disciplines?
Are the skills of being able to ask the right questions, you mean?
And clarity, I suppose, would be helpful for other philosophy disciplines.
Yeah, very much so. Pointing out when distinctions need to be made, noting ambiguous terms, that often can be helpful. Probably analytics do have an edge on continental philosophers in general with respect to that. I'd say there's certain areas of continental philosophy where they're very good at doing that sort of thing, hermeneutics, and I'd say historians are really good at doing that sort of thing as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. I got up a bit on my soapbox in that one. Any other questions or concerns?
Maybe a similar question from a continental perspective. Analytic philosophy has been really important in sciences. Books Russell went on to kind of influence computer science from the very beginning.
Yeah.
What would continental philosophy offer for the natural sciences?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. I don't think an awful lot, quite frankly. Maybe thinking about conceptions of time, conceptions of matter. I'd say there's this new movement of speculative realism, I think it's called, where they're doing some bridge work between analytic and continental, and talking a lot about ontology and objects, and how you might actually use Heidegger to talk about science in any way. I think where continental philosophy has interesting stuff to say about the application of science is in terms of societal things, organization of institutions, power. That's not the natural sciences themselves. Insofar as we're talking about just the practice of a physicist qua physicist, I don't think continental philosophy has all that much to offer. There's a whole field of science studies out there that gives continental philosophy a particularly bad name because a lot of that stuff is just not very good. I don't even know what it is. I can't even say it's not good work because I don't think it falls in the category of work, which I'm sure is going to raise somebody's objection. But in terms of how we apply science, what we make of the sciences, I think there's useful stuff. The question is whether it's worth the opportunity cost that it requires to read through this dense literature. And I don't know. I suspect not, perhaps. Yeah.
So I'm curious as to what you think analytic philosophy has to offer the natural sciences. And I say this as an analytic philosopher.
Yeah.
If I think about what could I say to a physicist that would help a physicist do his work?
Yeah.
Nothing. Right?
Yeah, but what can you...
I mean, there are interesting questions in the philosophy of science, and I do a little bit of that, not very much, but a little bit. But philosophy of science is clearly philosophy. It's not doing physics. Right?
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Right? And what have I got to offer a physicist or a biologist or any of these guys in the natural sciences? Nothing as far as I can see. It's not like they're itching for philosophers to come in and help them make distinctions. And
No, they're usually telling us how philosophy is no good and
Yeah.
bad and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. You're probably right about that. I would say, philosophers have a lot to contribute to. Do we want to consider this whole field of neuroscience, which is kind of a hazy field, I think, at this point, to be a natural science? I'd say so, right? Seems to be sort of an offshoot of biology. And I think there's a lot of conclusion jumping that goes on in